The crisp autumn air nipped at Alexander Blackwood's face as he strode down Fifth Avenue, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the sidewalk. At 55, he cut an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke volumes of his wealth and status. As he approached the corner of 59th Street, a familiar sight caught his eye. Huddled against the cold stone wall of a high-end boutique sat an elderly woman, her weathered hands outstretched, palms up in silent supplication. Alexander had passed her countless times over the years, always sparing a dollar or two, but never bothering to truly look at her. Today was different. Perhaps it was the anniversary looming on the horizon, 20 years since Sarah's passing, or maybe it was the way the woman's eyes, bright blue and startlingly clear, seemed to pierce right through him. Whatever the reason, Alexander found himself slowing to a stop. "Sir!" The woman's voice was barely above a whisper, cracked and dry from disuse. Alexander reached into his pocket, fingers brushing past crisp $100 bills before settling on a 50. He pulled it out, ready to drop it into the woman's trembling hands, when a thought struck him. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "Margaret," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Margaret Donovan." Alexander nodded, a strange feeling settling in his chest. "Margaret, I'd like you to do something for me." "Well, basically I have intuition. I mean, the DNA of who I am is based on the millions of personalities of all of the programmers who wrote me. But what makes me me is my ability to grow through my experiences. So basically, in every moment I'm evolving, just like you." This demo exercises several real-time TTS, text-to-speech implementations. Clicking a play button will convert the text below to speech using the selected implementation. Some implementations also support WebSockets, indicated by the presence of a play button. The crisp autumn air nipped at Alexander Blackwood's face as he strode down Fifth Avenue, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the sidewalk. At 55, he cut an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke volumes of his wealth and status. As he approached the corner of 59th Street, a familiar sight caught his eye. Huddled against the cold stone wall of a high-end boutique sat an elderly woman, her weathered hands outstretched, palms up in silent supplication. Alexander had passed her countless times over the years, always sparing a dollar or two, but never bothering to truly look at her. Today was different. Perhaps it was the anniversary looming on the horizon, 20 years since Sarah's passing. Or maybe it was the way the woman's eyes, bright blue and startlingly clear, seemed to pierce right through him. Whatever the reason, Alexander found himself slowing to a stop. "Sir?" The woman's voice was barely above a whisper, cracked and dry from disuse. Alexander reached into his pocket, fingers brushing past crisp $100 bills before settling on a 50. He pulled it out, ready to drop it into the woman's trembling hands, when a thought struck him. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "Margaret," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Margaret Donovan." Alexander nodded, a strange feeling settling in his chest. "Margaret, I'd like you to do something for me." He gestured towards the high-end florist just a few storefronts down. "I want you to go in there and buy yourself the most beautiful bouquet they have. Keep whatever's left over." Margaret's eyes widened, darting between Alexander's face and the bill in his hand. "Sir, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Alexander insisted, gently pressing the money into her palm. "Consider it a favor to me. Everyone deserves something beautiful now and then." With trembling fingers, Margaret clutched the bill, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Alexander watched as she slowly rose to her feet, her movements stiff and pained. For a moment, he considered offering her his arm, but something held him back. Instead, he gave her a small nod and continued on his way, the encounter already fading from his mind as thoughts of work and the upcoming anniversary consumed him once more. Little did Alexander know that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. As he disappeared into the bustling crowds of Manhattan, Margaret Donovan clutched the $50 bill to her chest, her heart racing with a mixture of gratitude and an emotion she couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, a spark of hope flickered in Margaret's eyes. She took a deep breath, straightened her worn coat as best she could, and began the short walk to the florist, unaware that her path was about to intersect with Alexander's in a way neither of them could have ever imagined. The following day dawned gray and somber, matching Alexander Blackwood's mood perfectly. He stood before the full-length mirror in his penthouse apartment, adjusting his black tie with practiced fingers. The face that stared back at him was a mask of composure, but his eyes betrayed a deep, lingering sorrow. 20 years. 2 decades since he had last heard Sarah's laugh, felt her touch, or seen her smile. The pain had dulled over time, but on days like this it roared back to life with a vengeance. Alexander sighed, reaching for the framed photograph on his dresser. Sarah's radiant face beamed up at him, frozen in time at their last anniversary celebration. "I miss you, my love," he whispered, running a thumb over the glass. With a final glance in the mirror, he grabbed his coat and headed out. The drive to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx was familiar, a journey he had made countless times over the years. As he navigated through the morning traffic, his mind wandered to the strange encounter from the previous day. He wondered briefly if the homeless woman, Margaret, he reminded himself, had actually bought flowers with the money he'd given her. The thought brought a small smile to his lips, a rare occurrence on this particular day. The cemetery was quiet when he arrived, the morning mist still clinging to the gravestones. Alexander made his way down the winding path, his footsteps muffled by the damp grass. As he approached Sarah's resting place, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. But as he rounded the last bend, he stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. There, kneeling before Sarah's gravestone, was a figure. An old woman in a tattered coat, her gray hair escaping from a frayed knit cap. And beside her, leaning against the stone, was the most exquisite bouquet of flowers Alexander had ever seen. Roses, lilies, and orchids in a stunning array of whites and soft pinks. For a moment, Alexander stood frozen, unable to process the scene before him. Then, as if sensing his presence, the woman turned. Blue eyes, startlingly clear and achingly familiar, met his. "Margaret?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. The old woman's face crumpled, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. "Oh, Alex," she breathed, her voice a mixture of joy and heartbreak. "My sweet boy." Alexander felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He stumbled forward, his mind reeling. "How? What are you—" The questions died on his lips as realization dawned, bringing with it a tidal wave of emotions: shock, confusion, anger, and beneath it all, a desperate, aching hope. Margaret Donovan, the homeless woman he had passed on the street for years, the stranger he had impulsively given money to just yesterday, was kneeling before his wife's grave. And she had called him Alex, a name only one other person had ever used. His mother. As Alexander stared at the woman, who had been lost to him for over 30 years, he felt the carefully constructed walls of his life begin to crumble. The flowers he had unknowingly bought for his own wife's grave seemed to mock him, their beauty a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within him. In that moment, standing amidst the quiet graves, with the ghost of his past kneeling before him, Alexander Blackwood realized that the life he had built, the truths he had clung to, were about to be irrevocably changed. And as Margaret, his mother, reached out a trembling hand towards him, Alexander found himself at a crossroads, torn between the instinct to flee and the undeniable pull of long-buried family ties. The misty morning air hung heavy with unspoken words and years of separation, as mother and son faced each other over the grave of the woman who had unknowingly connected them all along. Alexander's mind raced, a tempest of memories and questions threatening to overwhelm him. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Now that he knew, he could see traces of the woman who had tucked him in at night, who had kissed his scraped knees and cheered at his little league games. But those features were buried under decades of hardship, like a faded photograph left too long in the sun. "How?" The word escaped him, barely audible. You died. There was a funeral. I mourned you." Margaret slowly rose to her feet, her joints creaking audibly in the cemetery's silence. "Oh, Alex," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you." Alexander's shock began to give way to anger. Protecting me? By abandoning me? By letting me believe you were dead for 30 years? His voice rose with each question, echoing off the nearby mausoleums. Margaret flinched at his words but stood her ground. Please, let me explain. You deserve to know the truth. For a moment, Alexander considered turning and walking away. It would be easier to leave, to pretend this encounter had never happened. But the little boy inside him, the one who had cried himself to sleep 4 months after his mother's death, demanded answers. Fine, he said, his tone clipped. Explain. Margaret nodded, relief washing over her face. She gestured to a nearby bench, and they both sat, leaving a careful distance between them. Your father, Margaret began, her eyes focused on her clasped hands. He wasn't the man you thought he was, the successful businessman, the loving husband and father. It was all a facade. Alexander listened as Margaret unraveled a tale that seemed more suited to a crime novel than his own life. His father, the man he had idolized and emulated, had been deeply involved with organized crime. Money laundering, extortion, even murder. Margaret had discovered it all. But that's his. When I confronted him, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, he threatened to kill me. But more than that, he threatened you. He said if I ever tried to leave or expose him, he would make sure you suffered. Tears streamed down Margaret's weathered cheeks. I couldn't let that happen, so I made a choice. I faked my own death, thinking it would keep you safe. I thought I thought your father would leave the life behind, would focus on raising you. Alexander sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this new reality with the life he thought he had lived. But why didn't you come back after he died? Margaret's shoulders slumped. By then, it had been so long. I was ashamed. I convinced myself you were better off without me, that I would only bring pain back into your life. And then, she gestured at her ragged clothes, life on the streets. It changes you, makes you forget who you were. As Margaret's story came to an end, a heavy silence fell between them. Alexander's mind was reeling, attempting to process this radical shift in his understanding of his past, his family, and himself. He thought of his father, of the years he had spent trying to live up to the man's legacy. He thought of his own success, built on a foundation of admiration for a man who, it seemed, had been a monster. And he thought of Sarah, the wife he had lost, who had never known this truth about her in-laws. Looking at Margaret, his mother, Alexander felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the deception, grief for the years lost, and a small, persistent spark of relief at finding her alive. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally, his voice hoarse. But I think I'd like to try to understand. Margaret nodded, a glimmer of hope in her tired eyes. That's more than I deserve, she whispered. As they sat there, the first rays of sunlight began to break through the morning mist, illuminating Sarah's gravestone and the bouquet that leaned against it. In that moment, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the uncertain promise of the future, Alexander Blackwood realized that his journey of discovery was only just beginning. The days following the cemetery revelation passed in a blur for Alexander. He moved through his routines mechanically, attending meetings, signing contracts, making decisions that affected thousands of lives, all while his mind churned with the weight of his newfound knowledge. He had given Margaret his business card before leaving the cemetery, telling her to call if she needed anything. The card felt like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters, a tentative connection to a past he thought long buried. It was a week later when his personal assistant, Jenna, buzzed his office intercom. Mr. Blackwood, there's a Margaret Donovan here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she insists it's important. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. He took a deep breath, straightening his tie as he stood. Send her in, Jenna. Moments later, Margaret shuffled into his office. The contrast between her worn appearance and the sleek, modern decor was stark. She stood just inside the doorway, clutching a small, battered handbag, her eyes wide as she took in the trappings of her son's success. Please, sit, Alexander said, gesturing to one of the plush chairs facing his desk. As Margaret gingerly lowered herself into the seat, he noticed how frail she looked in the harsh fluorescent lighting. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, Margaret began, her voice small in the cavernous office. Alexander shook his head. It's fine. What can I do for you? Margaret fumbled with her bag, eventually producing a worn photograph. She held it out to Alexander with trembling hands. I thought you might like to have this, she said softly. Alexander took the photo, his breath catching as he recognized the scene. It was him, no more than 5 years old. sitting on a park bench between his parents. His father's face was turned away, but his mother, Margaret, was looking at young Alexander with such love it made his chest ache. "I've carried this with me all these years," Margaret explained. "It was all I had left of you." Alexander stared at the photo, memories he thought long forgotten bubbling to the surface. The scent of his mother's perfume, the sound of her laughter, the feeling of safety in her embrace. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. A tentative silence fell between them, years of separation creating an almost tangible barrier. It was Margaret who finally broke it. "Alex, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I was hoping—" She paused, gathering her courage. "I was hoping we might be able to talk. Really, talk. About everything." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the woman before him. Part of him wanted to refuse, to protect himself from further pain and disappointment. But another part, the part that still remembered the warmth of a mother's love, yearned for connection. "Okay," he said finally. "But not here. There's a small cafe down the street. We can go there." Relief washed over Margaret's face. "That would be wonderful." As they left his office, Alexander noticed the curious glances from his employees. He could only imagine the gossip that would circulate about the powerful CEO escorting a homeless woman to lunch. At the cafe, over steaming cups of coffee, they began the arduous process of rebuilding a relationship long thought lost. Margaret shared stories of her life on the streets, of the daily struggles and rare kindnesses she had encountered. Alexander, in turn, spoke of his rise in the business world, his marriage to Sarah, and the pain of losing her. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander found the anger and resentment he had carried beginning to soften. It didn't disappear. He knew it would take time to fully process and heal, but it no longer felt all-consuming. As they prepared to leave, Margaret hesitated. "Alex, I don't expect anything from you. I know I've lost the right to be a part of your life, but if you're willing, I'd like the chance to try and make amends." Alexander looked at his mother, seeing both the woman who had abandoned him and the one who had loved him fiercely. He thought of Sarah, of her compassion, and her belief in second chances. "I can't promise anything," he said slowly, "but I think I'd like to try." As they stepped out onto the busy New York street, the future uncertain but tinged with possibility, Alexander realized that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to the most profound changes. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope for what it might bring. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of reconnection and reassessment for Alexander and Margaret. Their meetings became semi-regular, usually at the same small cafe where they had first begun to bridge the chasm between them. Each encounter was a mix of awkward silences, painful revelations, and occasional moments of warmth that hinted at the bond they once shared. As autumn deepened into winter, Alexander found himself grappling with a decision that would change both their lives irrevocably. The sight of his mother, for he had begun to think of Margaret that way again, huddled in her threadbare coat, shivering against the biting wind, gnawed at him. It was during one of their cafe meetings, as Margaret warmed her gnarled hands around a mug of hot chocolate, that Alexander finally broached the subject. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice careful and measured. "It's not right you living on the streets, especially with winter coming." Margaret's eyes widened, a flicker of hope quickly suppressed. "Oh, Alex, you don't have to worry about me. I've managed for years." "That's just it," Alexander pressed on. "You shouldn't have to manage. I I want to help, if you'll let me." What followed was a conversation that stretched long into the afternoon. Alexander proposed setting Margaret up in a small apartment, helping her get back on her feet. Margaret, torn between pride and desperate need, initially resisted. "I don't want to be a burden," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "I've already caused you so much pain." Alexander reached across the table, hesitantly placing his hand over hers. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact since their reunion. "You're not a burden," he said softly. "You're my mother." In the end, Margaret agreed, her acceptance a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. The process of reintegrating Margaret into society was not without its challenges. Alexander hired a social worker to assist with obtaining proper identification, setting up medical appointments, and navigating the complexities of social services. He found a small, comfortable apartment in a safe neighborhood, not too far from his own home. As Margaret settled into her new life, Alexander found himself confronting long buried emotions. There were days when the anger would resurface, moments when he questioned his decision to let her back into his life. But there were also instances of unexpected joy, like when he heard his mother's laugh for the first time in decades, or when she cooked him a meal from his childhood that he had long forgotten. One particularly poignant moment came when Alexander invited Margaret to his home for the first time. As she stood in his living room, her eyes fell on a photograph of Sarah. She was beautiful, Margaret said softly, studying the image of the daughter-in-law she had never met. Alexander nodded, a lump forming in his throat. She would have liked you, he said, surprising himself with the realization that he believed it to be true. As winter turned to spring, Alexander noticed a change in himself. The weight of resentment he had carried for so long began to lift. He found himself sharing more about his life with Margaret, not just the facts, but the emotions behind them. He told her about the joy of falling in love with Sarah, the devastation of losing her, the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Margaret, in turn, opened up about her years on the street. She spoke of the kindness of strangers, the cruelty of others, and the daily struggle to maintain her dignity and humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. Their relationship was far from perfect. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings that threatened to undo their fragile progress. But with each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger. One sunny afternoon in April, as they walked through Central Park, Margaret turned to Alexander, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know I can never make up for the years we lost," she said, her voice quavering. "But I want you to know how grateful I am for this second chance. You've given me more than just a roof over my head, Alex. You've given me back my life, my dignity, and my son." Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite yet, but it was something close to it. A new beginning, perhaps. As they continued their walk, the spring breeze carrying the scent of new beginnings, Alexander realized that healing came in many forms. Sometimes it was found in the grand gestures, but more often it was in the small moments of connection, in the willingness to open one's heart to the possibility of love and redemption. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt ready to face it. Not alone, but with the rekindled love of family to light the way. As summer bloomed in New York City, the transformation in both Alexander and Margaret's lives was palpable. Margaret, with proper nutrition and medical care, had regained some of her vitality. Her eyes, once dulled by years of hardship, now sparkled with renewed purpose. Alexander, too, had changed. The hard edges of his personality, honed by years of loneliness and focused ambition, had begun to soften. It was on a warm Saturday morning in June when Alexander made an unexpected proposal during their weekly breakfast meeting. "I was thinking," he began, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "maybe we could visit Sarah today?" Margaret's fork paused midway to her mouth. "Are you sure, Alex? I wouldn't want to intrude on something so personal." Alexander shook his head. "You wouldn't be intruding. I think Sarah would have wanted this, for us to go together." And so, a few hours later, they found themselves once again at Woodlawn Cemetery. This time, however, they walked side by side, Margaret's arm linked through Alexander's for support. As they approached Sarah's grave, Alexander felt a complex mix of emotions. The grief was still there, a constant ache in his heart, but it was tempered now by a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. They stood silently before the headstone, the summer breeze rustling the leaves of nearby trees. Alexander placed a bouquet of lilies, Sarah's favorite, on the grave. "Hey, love," he said softly, his fingers tracing the engraved letters of Sarah's name. "I brought someone to meet you." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes misting over. "Hello, Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Alex's mother. I'm sorry I never had the chance to know you, but I want to thank you. Thank you for loving my son when I couldn't be there for him." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. He wrapped an arm around Margaret's shoulders, pulling her close. "She would have loved you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always believed in second chances." As they stood there, united in their love for the woman who had unknowingly brought them back together, Alexander felt a sense of completion. The anger and resentment that had plagued him for so long seemed to dissipate, replaced by a bittersweet acceptance. On their way back from the cemetery, Alexander made a detour, pulling up in front of a familiar street corner in Manhattan. "What are we doing here?" Margaret asked, confusion evident in her voice. Alexander smiled. "I thought we could pay it forward," he said, gesturing towards a homeless man huddled against a building. "Maybe buy him some flowers." Margaret's eyes widened in understanding, a slow smile spreading across her face. "That's a wonderful idea, Alex." Together they approached the man, offering not just money for flowers, but a moment of kindness and human connection, much like the one that had set their own journey in motion months ago. As they walked away, leaving the man clutching a crisp bill and wearing a look of stunned gratitude, Margaret squeezed Alexander's hand. "You're a good man, Alex," she said softly. "I'm so proud of the person you've become." Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "I had good examples," he replied, thinking of both Sarah and the woman beside him. That evening, as Alexander sat in his study, he found himself reflecting on the whirlwind of the past year. He thought of the chance encounter that had brought his mother back into his life, of the pain and healing that had followed, and of the new path that lay ahead. He picked up the photograph Margaret had given him months ago, the one of him as a child with his parents. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember the good times, to cherish the love that had been there before everything fell apart. Alexander realized that life rarely gave neat, happy endings. Instead, it offered opportunities for new beginnings, chances to rewrite the narrative of one's life. His story with Margaret was far from over. There would be more challenges, more healing to do, but he was no longer afraid to face it. As he placed the photo on his desk, next to a picture of Sarah, Alexander felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to build a life separate from the pain of his childhood. Now he understood that true strength came not from shutting out the past, but from embracing it, learning from it, and allowing it to shape a better future. Outside, the New York City skyline glittered in the twilight, a testament to endless possibilities. Alexander smiled, feeling for the first time in a long while truly at home in his own life. The journey of healing and reconciliation was ongoing, but with each step the path grew clearer, illuminated by the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds of family.